The wind at this altitude was deafening. It roared past Izuku Midoriya's ears like a hurricane, biting at his tear-streaked cheeks and threatening to rip his grip from the pant leg of his idol. Far below, the sprawling metropolis of Muzidafu was a blur of concrete and glass, moving at a sickening speed. Hey, hey, hey! Release me! Your fanaticism is too much! All Might shouted, his booming voice barely cutting through the rush of the air. He pushed a massive, muscular hand against Izuku's head, trying to pry the boy off. If I let go now, I'll die! Izuku screamed, his eyes squeezed shut, his knuckles white as he clung to the indestructible fabric of the number 1 hero's costume. The wind whipped his messy green curls wildly. All Might paused, his permanently plastered smile twitching slightly. Oh. Right. Good point. A heavy drop of blood seeped from the corner of All Might's mouth, unseen by the terrified boy clinging to his leg. The hero's eyes widened, a flash of genuine panic crossing his shadowed features. Damn it, Toshinori thought, the familiar, agonizing burn spreading through his left side. My time is up. I can't hold this form much longer. I need to land? Now. All Might banked sharply, scanning the cityscape until he spotted a suitable, isolated location. A mundane, flat-topped commercial building with a chain-link fence and a heavy, reinforced door. He angled his descent. They hit the roof with a resounding thud that rattled the HVAC units and sent a shockwave through the tar-papered surface. Izuku let go immediately, collapsing onto his hands and knees. He gasped for breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had done it. He had actually grabbed onto All Might. That was completely reckless. All Might scolded, though his voice lacked its usual television-ready bravado. He turned his back to the boy, his massive shoulders heaving as he marched toward the rooftop exit. I'll have the people downstairs contact the police for you. Wait here until they arrive. Now, I must be going. Wait! Izuku scrambled up, his hands reaching out toward the retreating mountain of muscle. He couldn't let him leave. Not yet. Not before he asked the question that had been suffocating him for 10 years. No time! I must go! All Might insisted, his hand resting on the metal handle of the roof door. Tell him, Izuku's mind screamed. Ask him. This is your only chance. The memories flashed behind Izuku's eyes in a cruel, rapid-fire sequence. The cold, sterile smell of the doctor's office. The X-ray of his foot, a dual joint mocking him with its presence. His mother, weeping on her knees, clutching him to her chest and apologizing for something she couldn't control. I'm sorry, Izuku. I'm so sorry. And then, just hours ago, the smell of burnt paper and caramelizing sugar. Katsuki Bakugo's crimson eyes, glaring down at him with unfiltered disdain. If you want to be a hero that badly, there's a quick way to do it. Believe that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life, and take a swan dive off the roof of the building. The words had burned a hole in Izuku's soul. He needed an answer. Not from his mother, who only offered pity. Not from his teachers, who offered indifference. Not from Bakugo, who offered cruelty. He needed an answer from the top. From the symbol of peace. Izuku clenched his fists, his body trembling so violently he felt his joints ache. He squeezed his eyes shut, bowing his head as he screamed the words into the roaring wind of the rooftop. Can someone without a quirk be like you? All Might froze. The hand on the door handle stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the wind. Izuku's chest heaved. He didn't open his eyes. He couldn't bear to look, but the words tumbled out of him like water from a broken dam. I don't have a quirk, Izuku stammered, his voice cracking, thick with unshed tears. And because of that, people constantly mock me. They tell me I'm useless. They tell me I'm a Deku. But I think saving people is the most amazing thing in the world. I want to save people with a fearless smile. I want to be the greatest hero, just like Y. Izuku opened his eyes, the final word catching in his throat. The mountain of muscle was gone. In his place stood a skeletal man. His skin was sallow, hanging loosely over angular, protruding bones. He wore clothes several sizes too large, completely swallowing his emaciated frame. His eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, shrouded in heavy shadows, glowing with a dim, haunting blue light. A thick cloud of steam rolled off the man's shoulders, dissipating into the afternoon air. The man coughed violently, a spray of blood painting the gray concrete of the roof. Izuku screamed. A fake? An imposter? You're so skinny! The skeletal man wiped the blood from his chin with the back of a bony hand, letting out a long, ragged sigh. I am All Might, he rasped. His voice was entirely different, hollow, exhausted, stripped of all its booming charisma. And no way. Izuku stumbled backward, his back hitting the chain-link fence. His mind fractured. The symbol of peace, the invincible titan who had never lost a fight, was standing before him looking like a stiff breeze would snap him in half. You know how guys at the pool suck in their gut to look buff? Toshinori asked, sitting down heavily against the railing, his long limbs folding like a lawn chair. It's like that. It's a fake. Izuku whispered, his reality crumbling. Toshinori's hollow eyes hardened. He looked at the boy, truly looked at him, and saw the utter devastation written across his freckled face. Toshinori hated this. He hated shattering illusions. He was supposed to be the pillar that held up the world's hope. But reality was a cruel, unforgiving master. A fearless smile, huh? Toshinori murmured. He reached up, grasping the hem of his oversized white t-shirt. You want to know the reality of being a hero, kid? Look! Toshinori pulled the shirt up. Izuku gasped, his hands flying to cover his mouth. The left side of Toshinori's chest and stomach was a mangled ruin. It looked like a crater carved into human flesh. The skin was violently purple and red, radiating outward in thick, jagged keloid scars that twisted around his ribcage. It wasn't just a scar, it was a testament to a horrific, unsurvivable violence. The sheer circumference of the wound suggested that whatever had hit him had completely hollowed him out. 5 years ago, Toshinori said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. An enemy attack. My respiratory system was nearly destroyed. My stomach was completely removed. I've had countless surgeries, but the damage is permanent. I waste away a little more every day. Right now, I can only do hero work for about 3 hours a day. The rest of the time, I look like this. Izuku stared at the wound, paralyzed. 5 years ago, was that the fight with Toxic Chainsaw? Toshinori chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. You know your stuff. But no. That punk couldn't do this to me. This fight was kept under wraps. The public doesn't know. The symbol of peace cannot be seen as vulnerable. I smile, to hide the fear inside. To trick the world into feeling safe, and to trick myself into being brave. Pro heroes are always risking their lives. Some villains simply can't be beaten without power. Toshinori let the shirt drop, concealing the nightmare once more. He looked up at the boy. The kid was shaking. He looked so small, so fragile. Toshinori took a deep breath. It was time to deliver the crushing blow. It was the responsible thing to do. He couldn't let this quirkless child run out into a world of monsters believing that a good heart was enough to stop a bullet or a blast of fire. He had to tell him no. He had to tell him to become a police officer or a firefighter. Something realistic. I'm sorry, kid. But you cannot be a hero without a quirk. The words formed on his tongue. He opened his mouth to speak, but as he did, his gaze drifted downward. When the boy had collapsed earlier, something had fallen from his bright yellow backpack. It was a notebook. The edges were charred black, and the cover was warped and waterlogged, but the title was still legible in neat, handwritten kanji. Hero Analysis for the Future, number 13. Toshinori paused. He reached out with a skeletal arm and picked the notebook off the concrete. Ah! And my notebook! Izuku flinched, reaching out instinctively before pulling his hands back in embarrassment. Toshinori didn't hand it back immediately. Curiosity, sparked by the boy's earlier encyclopedic knowledge of his fights, took over. He opened the book. His sunken blue eyes widened. Every page was covered in dense, meticulous, almost frantic handwriting. There were incredibly detailed sketches of heroes, some rookies, some veterans. But it wasn't just fan by adoration. It was raw, unadulterated analysis. He turned a page. Mount Lady. The entry detailed her debut from earlier that very morning. The boy had already deduced her height, her estimated weight, the structural limitations of her gigantification in urban environments, and the collateral damage risks associated with her center of gravity. There were notes on how she could minimize property damage by altering her stance. He flipped another page. Camus Woods. Notes on the tensile strength of his wood, the specific ignition temperature, and tactical suggestions for pairing him with a water-based hero to nullify his fire weakness. Toshinori flipped faster. He saw pages analyzing villain quirks, breaking down their psychological tells, their cooldown rates, their line-of-sight dependencies. It was brilliant. It was terrifyingly brilliant. The level of observational deduction in this charred, soggy notebook rivaled the professional analyses produced by Sir Nitai's agency. Toshinori looked up from the pages. The boy was staring at his shoes, his shoulders hunched, waiting for the rejection he clearly expected, waiting for the number one hero to strike the final nail into the coffin of his dreams. I don't have a quirk. And because of that, people constantly mock me. Toshinori remembered a rooftop from over 40 years ago. He remembered rain, and the warm, strong hand of a woman with jet black hair. He remembered looking at her with the same desperate, pleading eyes this boy had. I am quirkless, a young Toshinori had said, his voice trembling. But I want to create a world where everyone can smile together. I want to be a pillar. Nana Shimura hadn't laughed at him. She hadn't told him to be realistic. She had looked at a quirkless teenager with an impossible dream and smiled. Toshinori looked at the charred notebook again. Why was it burnt? Why was it wet? Someone had done this to him. Someone had tried to destroy this boy's passion, and yet, the boy had fished it out of a koi pond, dried it off, and carried it with him. He had grabbed onto a flying man's leg, risking death, just for the chance to ask if he could be a hero. Does he have the heart? Toshinori wondered. He has the mind. God, does he have the mind? But what about the spirit? Toshinori closed the notebook. He tapped the cover with his long, bony index finger. Young man, Toshinori said softly. What happened to this book? Izuku flinched, his cheeks burning red. A classmate. He blew it up with his quirk. And threw it out the window. Into a fish pond. Why? Izuku swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. Because I told him I was going to apply for UA High School. The hero course. Toshinori's breath hitched. UA. The hardest school in the country. And this quirkless boy, despite being abused, despite being told no by the entire world, was still aiming for the absolute top. He's just like me, Toshinori thought, a profound, aching realization washing over him. No. He's smarter than me. I was just a meathead with a dream. This kid is a tactician. Toshinori thought of the sludge villain contained securely in the empty soda bottles in his cargo pockets. He thought of his fading power. The embers of One for All were dying out inside him. He needed a successor. He had come to Muzurifu to meet Mirio Togata, the boy Nitai had recommended. Togata was strong, capable, and had an incredible quirk. He was the logical choice. The realistic choice. But looking at this trembling, broken boy in front of him, Toshinori felt the phantom warmth of Nana Shimura's hand on his shoulder. A hero is someone who meddles when they don't need to, Nana's voice echoed in his memory. A hero is someone who saves the heart. Toshinori stood up. His knees popped in the quiet air. He walked over to Izuku and gently handed the burned notebook back to him. Izuku took it, keeping his eyes glued to the floor, bracing himself for the inevitable. Young man, Toshinori said, his voice lacking the booming echo of All Might, but carrying a gravity that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. Look at me. Slowly, painfully Izuku lifted his head. His large green eyes were swimming in tears, his lower lip quivering. You asked me if someone without a quirk could become a hero, Toshinori said, his blue eyes piercing directly into Izuku's soul. Izuku nodded, a tiny, jerky motion. Toshinori didn't smile. He didn't offer a platitude. He spoke with the absolute, unwavering conviction of a man who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders for decades. Yes. You can be a hero. The words hung in the air. At first, Izuku didn't comprehend them. His brain, so wired for rejection, so accustomed to the word no, simply refused to process the syllables. He stared at the skeletal man, waiting for the punchline. Waiting for the but. With a mind like yours, Toshinori continued, gesturing to the notebook, and a spirit that refuses to let go of a dream even when it's burned and thrown away, you have the makings of a true hero. It would be an impossibly hard path. You would have to fight twice as hard as anyone else. You would need support gear, rigorous physical training, and an unbreakable will. But yes. I believe you can do it. Yes. You can be a hero. The dam broke. Izuku's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the rough tar paper of the roof, his hands clutching his chest over his heart. He let out a sound, a primal, ragged, ugly sob that tore from the very bottom of his lungs. It was 10 years of agony, 10 years of isolation, 10 years of being a Deku finally shattering. The doctor's cold diagnosis. The mocking laughter of his classmates. The spider lily on his desk. Bakugo's explosions burning his shoulders. His mother's tearful apologies. All of it washed away in a torrential flood of tears, cleansed by a single word from the only man who mattered. Izuku slammed his forehead against the concrete, bowing deeply, weeping so hard his entire body convulsed. He clawed at the ground, his cries echoing across the empty rooftop. Toshinori watched the boy cry. He didn't tell him to stand up. He didn't tell him to stop crying. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, how heavy the word no could be, and he knew how liberating the word yes was. He stepped forward and placed a heavy, bony hand on the boy's trembling shoulder, offering a silent, steady comfort. They stayed like that for several minutes, the only sound the wind and the boy's desperate, cathartic sobs. Eventually, the tears began to slow. Izuku wiped his face with his dirt-stained sleeves, his eyes red and puffy, his breath hitching in a series of wet hiccups. He slowly sat back on his heels, looking up at the skeletal man with a reverence that bordered on worship. Thank you, Izuku whispered, his voice completely raw. Thank you? You don't know what that means to me. I'll train. I'll build gadgets. I'll work out every day. I'll prove you right. Toshinori smiled. It wasn't the blinding, pearly white grin of all might. It was a soft, genuine, incredibly human smile. I have no doubt you would, young man. You have the heart of a hero. Toshinori knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with Izuku. The shadows in his eyes seemed to dance with a new, vibrant light. However, what if I told you there was another way? Izuku blinked, confused. Another way? I told you that you could be a hero without a quirk, Toshinori said slowly, measuring his words. And I meant it. But, the path of a quirkless hero is fraught with a ceiling you cannot punch through with determination alone. There are villains out there, monsters, that require absolute power to stop. Toshinori pointed to his ruined stomach. Monsters that can do this to the strongest man in the world. Izuku swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the concealed wound. I understand. But I can't change my genetics. I have an extra joint in my toe. The doctor said. Forget the doctors, Toshinori interrupted softly. Forget genetics. I am asking you a question, young man. How would you like a quirk? Izuku stared. His brain misfired again. How? Quirks can't be given or taken away. It's scientifically impossible. Unless, wait, there are theories on the dark web about quirk trafficking, and rumored villains from the dawn of the quirk era who could manipulate factors, but those are just urban legends, right? Unless you're saying, Stop, Toshinori chuckled, holding up a hand. Your muttering is quite intense. Listen to me. The public believes my quirk is a naturally occurring strength enhancement. I've dodged questions about it in interviews for decades. But the truth is, my quirk was passed down to me like a sacred torch. Izuku's jaw dropped. Passed down. Yes. Toshinori held out his right hand, palm up. He closed his eyes. Suddenly, a profound pressure filled the air. It wasn't the wind. It was an aura. Izuku gasped as he watched a web of glowing, golden-red energy flare across Toshinori's bony forearm. It pulsed with a heartbeat of its own, radiating immense heat and raw, unadulterated power. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. The true name of my power, Toshinori said, his voice echoing with the weight of history, is one for all. One for all, Izuku whispered, the syllables tasting heavy on his tongue. One person cultivates the power, and passes it to another. The next cultivates it, and passes it on again. It is the crystallized power of voices crying out for help, forged by the courage of those who came before. It is a power meant to save others. Toshinori let the energy fade, opening his eyes to look at Izuku. I was born quirkless, just like you. Izuku stopped breathing. The number one hero. The symbol of peace. He was, like him? My master saw something in me, Toshinori continued gently. Just as I see something in you. My time is running out. This body can no longer sustain the embers of one for all. I have been searching for a successor. Someone worthy of the torch. Toshinori stood up, his towering, skeletal frame casting a long shadow over the boy. I had planned to pass it to a student with an already powerful quirk. To stack strength upon strength. But looking at your notes, looking at your heart, I realized that raw power without the intellect to guide it, or the compassion to temper it, is just violence. Toshinori extended a hand down to Izuku. Izuku Midoriya. I deem you worthy of my power. Will you accept it? Izuku looked at the extended hand. It felt like a dream. It felt like he had fallen off the roof and was experiencing a beautiful hallucination in his final moments. But the concrete beneath his knees was hard and cold. The wind was sharp. This was real. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask what the catch was. He didn't consider the immense, crushing pressure of replacing the symbol of peace. All he saw was the hand of a god, reaching down to pull him out of hell. Izuku reached up and grabbed Toshinori's hand. Yes, Izuku said, his voice steady for the first time in his life. I accept. Toshinori hauled the boy to his feet, a wide, genuine grin breaking across his gaunt face. Excellent. No hesitation. I like that. However, you can't just take it right now. If you tried to receive one for all in your current physical state, the raw energy would blow your limbs completely off your body. Izuku turned entirely white. Blow my limbs off? Indeed. Toshinori laughed, coughing up a small speck of blood. Your body is an unbaked vessel. We need to forge it into a container that can hold a tempest. You said you wanted to apply for UA high school, correct? Why, yes. The entrance exam is in exactly 10 months. 10 months, Toshinori mused, stroking his sharp chin. It will be the most grueling, agonizing 10 months of your life. You will bleed. You will vomit. You will want to quit. Can you handle it? Izuku clenched his fists, the burnt notebook pressed against his chest. He thought of Bakugo. He thought of his mother. He looked at All Might. I've been in pain my whole life, Izuku said softly, a fire igniting in his emerald eyes. I can handle anything you throw at me. Toshinori felt a shiver run down his spine. The sheer determination radiating from the boy was palpable. Yes, Toshinori thought. He is the one. Give me your phone, Toshinori commanded. Izuku fumbled in his pocket, pulling out his battered smartphone and unlocking it. Toshinori took it, quickly punching in a series of numbers and saving the contact under a single letter. T. That is my personal, encrypted number, Toshinori said, handing the phone back. Do not share it with anyone. Not your mother, not your friends. As of today, our relationship is a closely guarded secret. If the villains knew I was training a successor, they would hunt you down before you could even throw a punch. I understand, Izuku said, slipping the phone into his pocket as if it were a priceless artifact. Tomorrow morning. 6 a.m. Meet me at Takoba Municipal Beach Park. Wear clothes you don't mind ruining. Toshinori turned toward the roof door, placing his hand on the handle. He paused, patting the bulging pockets of his oversized cargo pants. He felt the firm plastic of the 2 2-liter soda bottles, the thick, viscous sludge shifting inside them. The villain was still securely contained. Good, Toshinori thought. I need to get this filth to Tsukachi before he wakes up and tries to burst the caps. All Might? Izuku called out. Toshinori looked back over his shoulder. Thank you, Izuku said, bowing respectfully. I won't let you down, Toshinori smiled. I know you won't, young Midoriya. Go home. Rest. Tomorrow, your true hell begins. With that, Toshinori opened the heavy metal door and descended into the stairwell, leaving Izuku alone on the roof. For a long time, Izuku just stood there. The wind had died down. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent, painting the Muzdalifa skyline in brilliant strokes of gold and crimson. Izuku walked over to the edge of the roof, his hands gripping the chain-link fence. He looked down at the city. It looked entirely different than it had an hour ago. Before, it was a city that belonged to everyone else. A city of quirks, of heroes, of people who fit in. A city that had no place for a quirkless Deku. Now, the city looked like a promise. It looked like a responsibility. He pulled the burnt notebook from his chest. He traced the charred edges with his thumb. Bakugo had tried to destroy his dream today, and in doing so, he had inadvertently led Izuku straight into the arms of destiny. Izuku turned and walked toward the exit. He felt lighter. The suffocating weight he had carried for 10 years was gone. In its place was a new weight. The weight of expectations, the weight of a legacy, the weight of the greatest quirk in the world. But it wasn't a weight that crushed him. It was a weight that anchored him. A few miles away, Detective Naomasa Tsukachi stood in the alleyway behind the Muzdalifa police precinct, smoking a cigarette. He checked his watch, sighing. A sudden gust of wind rattled the dumpster, and a massive, muscular figure dropped from the sky, landing with a heavy crunch on the pavement. All Might! Tsukachi smiled, crushing his cigarette under his shoe. You're cutting it close. Your time limit. I know, Naomasa, All Might boomed, though his smile seemed brighter, more genuine than usual. He reached into his pockets and pulled out 2 soda bottles filled with a disgusting, swirling sludge. I come bearing gifts. A purse snatcher with a rather nasty fluid quirk caught him in an underpass. Tsukachi took the bottles gingerly, examining the trapped villain. Excellent work as always. No collateral damage? None at all. All Might laughed loudly. A perfectly clean apprehension. Good. The chief has been on my neck about the property damage bills from your fights lately. I'll get this guy processed and into a containment cell immediately. Tsukachi looked up at his friend, noticing a distinct shift in the hero's demeanor. The usual exhaustion that clouded All Might's eyes near the end of his limit was gone. You look happy. Did something happen? All Might looked up at the sky, the golden hour light catching the sharp angles of his heroic face. He thought of a freckled boy with a burned notebook and a heart of pure gold. Naomasa, All Might said softly. I think the future is going to be just fine. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Katsuki Bakugo was walking home alone. He kicked a soda can down the sidewalk, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his brow furrowed in a perpetual scowl. He was angry. He didn't even know why he was angry, which only made him angrier. He walked past a narrow, shadowed alleyway near the shopping district. It was quiet. A stray cat darted across the mouth of the alley, disappearing into the gloom. Bakugo didn't even look twice. He just kept walking, utterly unaware of how closely his life had brushed against disaster. If the sludge villain had escaped All Might's pockets, if the #1 hero had dropped the bottles in midair to reprimand a clinging fan, that alleyway would have been a war zone. Bakugo would have been fighting for his life, suffocating, humiliated in front of a crowd of useless heroes. But none of that happened. Instead, Bakugo just scowled at a crack in the pavement. Stupid Deku, he muttered to himself. Where the hell did he run off to? Probably crying to his mom. Bakugo clenched his fists, small sparks popping against the fabric of his pockets. Deku's face earlier today, that pathetic, trembling defiance. It pissed him off. A pebble in his path. Nothing more. Yue Hero course, Bakugo scoffed aloud, kicking another rock. As if. I'm the only one from that trash junior high going to Yue. I'm going to be the #1. Better than All Might. Deku is just a pebble. But as Bakugo walked, a strange, unexplainable chill ran down his spine. He stopped, looking over his shoulder. The street was empty. He shook his head, annoyed at his own paranoia, and continued his march home, oblivious to the fact that the hierarchy of his entire world had just been irrevocably shattered. The sun had fully set by the time Izuku arrived at his apartment building. He stood outside the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He took a deep breath. He needed to compose himself. If his mother saw his red, puffy eyes, she would immediately assume he had been bullied again, and go into a panic. He slapped his cheek slightly, forcing a neutral expression. He opened the door. "I'm home," he called out. "Izuku." Inko Midoriya hurried out of the kitchen, wearing her pink apron, wiping her hands on a towel. She looked at him, her eyes instantly scanning for injuries, a habit honed by years of her son coming home with bruises and singed clothes. "You're late." "I was getting worried." "Dinner is almost." Inko stopped. She stared at her son. Something was different. His clothes were dirty, yes. His backpack looked a little damp. But it wasn't his appearance. It was his posture. For the past 10 years, Izuku had walked with a slight slouch. A defensive curl, as if he were constantly trying to make himself smaller, trying to avoid the blows of the world. He always looked at the floor, or slightly off to the side, apologizing with his body language for simply existing. But right now, Izuku was standing straight. His shoulders were pulled back. His chin was up. And his eyes. Inko gasped softly. The hollow, desperate longing that usually haunted her son's green eyes was gone. In its place was a sharp, brilliant, piercing light. It was a look of absolute focus. It was the look of a boy who had finally found the horizon. "Izuku?" Inko asked softly, dropping the towel. Did something happen today?" Izuku looked at his mother. He thought of all the times she had cried for him. He thought of her agonizing guilt, the way she blamed herself for his quirklessness. He couldn't tell her about All Might. He couldn't tell her about One for All, but he could give her peace. Izuku smiled. It wasn't his usual, forced, nervous smile. It was radiant. "Mom," Izuku said, his voice ringing with a quiet, unshakable confidence. "I met someone today. And I realized something." "What is it, sweetie?" Inko asked, her hands clasped tightly together against her chest. Izuku stepped out of his shoes and walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her in a tight hug. Inko stiffened in surprise before melting into the embrace, burying her face in his shoulder. "I'm going to be a hero, Mom," Izuku whispered fiercely. "I'm going to Yui High School. And I'm going to make you proud. I promise." Inko closed her eyes, tears leaking into her son's dirty school uniform. She didn't understand what had changed. She didn't know who he had met, or what epiphany he had reached. But holding her son, feeling the rock-solid certainty in his voice, for the first time in 10 years, she didn't apologize. "I know you will, Izuku," she sobbed quietly, squeezing him back. "I know you will." Later that night, long after Inko had gone to sleep, Izuku sat at his desk. His room was a shrine to All Might. Posters, action figures, and banners covered every square inch of the walls. Izuku sat in the glow of his desk lamp, a brand new, pristine notebook laid open before him. He clicked his pen. He didn't write about Mount Lady. He didn't write about Kamui Woods. He wrote, Project Vessel. The 10-month plan. Underneath, he began to furiously draft a workout regimen. He cross-referenced his knowledge of kinesthetics, muscle hypertrophy, and caloric intake. He calculated his current body mass and the required density needed to withstand explosive kinetic feedback. He drew diagrams of leverage, of martial arts stances that minimized joint stress, of support gear concepts that could brace his forearms and shins. If All Might was giving him the greatest power in the world, Izuku was not going to be a passive recipient. He was going to analyze One for All like he analyzed everything else. He was going to master it. He was going to dissect the physics of the quirk and build a body and a fighting style specifically engineered to wield it. He wrote until his hand cramped. He wrote until the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a pale, pre-dawn light into his room. Izuku looked at the clock. 5:15 a.m. He stood up, stripping off his pajamas and pulling on a pair of ragged gray sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt. He laced up his red, oversized shoes. He grabbed a pair of thick gardening gloves from the closet. He looked at the poster of All Might pointing directly at him from across the room. The caption read, "He is here." Izuku smiled, his eyes burning with exhaustion and an unquenchable fire. "I am too," Izuku whispered to the poster. He turned, walked out of his bedroom, and headed out into the dawn. Takoba Municipal Beach Park was waiting. The symbol of peace was waiting. His destiny was waiting. And for the first time in his life, Izuku Midoriya was ready to meet it head-on. The smell hit Izuku Midoriya long before the ocean came into view. It was a suffocating, pungent odor, a vile concoction of rotting kelp, stagnant seawater, rusted iron, and decades of decaying household waste. It smelled of abandonment. Izuku crested the concrete embankment just as the first rays of the morning sun pierced the horizon, painting the sky in pale streaks of violet and gold. He stood at the railing, looking down at Takoba Municipal Beach Park. Calling it a beach was a cruel joke. It was a graveyard. Mountains of illegal dumping stretched out for miles along the coastline. Defunct refrigerators, rusted-out husks of cars, shattered television sets, and twisted tangles of construction rebar formed jagged, synthetic sand dunes that completely obscured the water. The crashing waves were barely audible over the hum of the nearby highway, lapping weakly against a fortress of tires and waterlogged mattresses. Izuku gripped the railing. He wore his faded gray sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt, a pair of thick canvas gardening gloves tucked into his waistband. The morning air was crisp and biting, but the cold didn't bother him. His heart was hammering a frantic, rhythmic drumbeat against his ribs. 6 a.m. He was exactly on time. "Ah! Young Midoriya! You're here!" A booming voice shattered the quiet morning. Izuku flinched, spinning around to see a massive, towering figure standing atop a nearby pile of discarded washing machines. Even silhouetted against the rising sun, the sheer, impossible musculature of the number one hero was unmistakable. "All Might!" Izuku gasped, his eyes going wide. With a mighty leap, the hero soared through the air, landing on the pavement next to Izuku with a heavy thud that cracked the concrete. He struck a heroic pose, his pearly white smile blinding in the dawn light. "Punctual. I like that. Are you ready to begin your journey to becoming a vessel, my boy?" "Yes, sir. I've been ready since yesterday." Izuku bowed so quickly he nearly headbutted the railing. All Might laughed, a hearty, booming sound. But the laugh ended abruptly in a violent, wet cough. A thick cloud of steam erupted from the hero's body, his massive muscles immediately deflating like a punctured balloon. Within 2 seconds the towering titan was replaced by the skeletal, sallow-faced Toshinori Yagi. He hunched over, wiping a smear of blood from his chin with a bony thumb. "Right, then," Toshinori rasped, his voice dropping 3 octaves into its hollow, exhausted register. "Let's get to work. First things first." Toshinori reached into the oversized pocket of his baggy yellow cargo pants, and pulled out a thick stack of papers stapled together. He held it out with a flourish. "I present to you, the Aim to Pass American Dream Plan," Toshinori announced, though it lacked the theatrical flair of his hero persona. "It's a rigorously calculated training regimen designed to build your physical strength over the next 10 months. I have mapped out your sleep schedule, your weight training, and even your macronutrient intake down to the gram." Izuku stared at the packet, his eyes wide. The number one hero had made a personalized schedule for him. He reached out with trembling hands to take it. "Thank you, All Might." Izuku paused, biting his lip. He reached into his backpack and pulled out his brand new, pristine notebook. I made one too. Last night." Toshinori blinked. He lowered his own packet and took the notebook from Izuku. "Project Vessel. The 10-month plan," the cover read. Toshinori opened it. His sunken blue eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. The level of detail was staggering. Izuku hadn't just made a workout plan. He had engineered a complete biomechanical overhaul. There were pages dedicated to calculating the tensile strength of human ligaments, cross-referenced with studies on kinetic impact absorption. Izuku had created a meal plan that perfectly balanced proteins, complex carbohydrates, and essential fats, adjusting the caloric surplus week by week to account for his projected muscle growth. There were diagrams of the beach. Izuku had already categorized the trash into weight classes, light debris for warm-ups, medium appliances for endurance hauling, and heavy objects, like cars, for maximum load resistance. He had calculated the drag coefficient of pulling objects through wet sand versus dry sand. Toshinori looked back and forth between his own hastily printed generic workout plan and the encyclopedic masterpiece in his hands. "Midoriya, my boy," Toshinori said, genuinely awestruck. "Did you sleep at all last night?" About 45 minutes, sir," Izuku admitted, rubbing the back of his neck sheepishly. "I got a little carried away. If I'm going to inherit One for All, I can't afford to have my limbs blown off. I need my body to be a shock absorber. I need to increase bone density and muscle mass simultaneously, focusing on my core and legs to anchor the power." Toshinori stared at the boy. He figured that out in one night? It had taken Toshinori 2 years to realize that leg strength was the key to stabilizing his smashes. With a dry chuckle, Toshinori crumpled his own packet and tossed it over his shoulder into the sand. "Well then, it seems my plan is obsolete. We will proceed with Project Vessel, but the venue remains the same." Toshinori gestured expansively toward the miles of garbage. "Takoba Municipal Beach Park," Toshinori explained, walking over to the railing. "Because of the ocean currents, things that are illegally dumped into the bay wash up right here. For years, people have taken advantage of it, dumping their own trash illegally to save money. The city gave up trying to clean it. It's a blemish on our community. And you want me to clean it?" Izuku asked, looking out over the sheer magnitude of the mess. There were thousands of tons of steel, plastic, and rotting wood. "By myself?" "Exactly." Toshinori smiled, turning to face him. "Heroes these days are all about showing off. They want flashy villain fights and media coverage. But the roots of heroism are volunteering. Community service, sweating in the dirt to make a small piece of the world better for the people living in it. You want to be a hero? You will clean this beach. Every single piece of trash. By the time the UA entrance exam arrives in 10 months, I want this sand pristine." Izuku looked at the mountains of garbage. It was an impossible task. A Sisyphean labor. If he looked at it as a whole, it was terrifying. So, he didn't look at it as a whole. Izuku pulled his thick canvas gloves from his waistband and slipped them on. He flexed his fingers, feeling the rough fabric. He walked past Toshinori, descending the concrete steps onto the sand. 10 months, Izuku said aloud, his voice steady. He walked over to a rusted, waterlogged mini-fridge half buried in the sand. He crouched down, digging his hands under the base. He braced his legs, taking a deep breath, and heaved. With a sickening squelch, the fridge tore free from the suction of the wet sand. Izuku staggered backward, his face immediately turning bright red from the exertion, veins popping on his forehead. He gritted his teeth, letting out a strained grunt as he dragged the heavy appliance foot by grueling foot toward the embankment. Toshinori stood at the railing, watching the boy struggle. A soft, genuine smile graced his skeletal features. "You have the mind, Midoriya," Toshinori thought. "And you certainly have the work ethic." But as Toshinori watched the boy haul the fridge, a small, insidious whisper of doubt echoed in the back of his mind. It was the voice of his former sidekick, Sir Night-Eye. "A hero is not just intellect and hard work, Toshinori. A true hero possesses a madness. An irrational instinct to throw themselves into the fire when logic dictates they run. Togata has it. Does your boy?" Toshinori frowned, crossing his bony arms. He had chosen Midoriya based on a notebook, a tragic backstory, and a rooftop conversation. It was a leap of faith. The boy wanted to save people, yes, but wanting to be a hero and having the raw, instinctual grit to look death in the face and move forward anyway were two entirely different things. Toshinori had never seen Midoriya in a crisis. He had never seen how the boy reacted to true danger. "Did I act too hastily?" Toshinori wondered, watching Izuku drop the fridge by the stairs and collapse to his knees, gasping for air. Will he freeze when the time comes? If he freezes with One for All, he will die. Toshinori shook his head, burying the thought. It was too late for doubts. He had made his choice. Now, it was up to him to forge the boy into someone who wouldn't freeze. "Good start, young Midoriya." Toshinori called out, walking down the stairs. Only about 10 million more to go. Get back to it. Push through your limits. Plus ultra. The first month was unadulterated agony. Every morning, Izuku dragged himself out of bed at 5 a.m., every muscle fiber in his body screaming in protest. His hands were a landscape of burst blisters and raw, peeling skin, hastily wrapped in medical tape. His arms felt like they were filled with lead, and his legs trembled simply from the act of walking downstairs. But he never stopped. He hauled tires. He moved shattered televisions. He dragged heavy tarps filled with rusted bolts and broken glass. When Toshinori arrived, he brought his pickup truck, and Izuku would load the heavy debris into the bed. At school, the exhaustion caught up to him. Izuku struggled to stay awake during lectures, his head bobbing, his notes turning into incomprehensible scribbles. But despite the fatigue, something fundamental was shifting inside him. The fear was gone. Aldera Junior High had always been a minefield. Izuku had spent his entire life navigating the hallways with his head bowed, avoiding eye contact, terrified of drawing attention to himself. He was the quirkless Deku, the bottom of the food chain, existing only to be a punching bag for Katsuki Bakugo and his lackeys. But now, walking through the halls, Izuku felt different. He wasn't slouching anymore. His shoulders were squared. His chin was up. The stinging insults thrown his way, the snickers, the mutters of Deku, no longer felt like burning coals. They felt hollow. Meaningless. They don't know, Izuku thought, looking at his heavily calloused hands under his desk during homeroom. They don't know what I'm building. They don't know who is waiting for me on the beach. The validation of the number one hero had acted like a cast on a broken bone, allowing Izuku's shattered self-esteem to heal and fuse stronger than before. Of course, this change did not go unnoticed. Katsuki Bakugo sat 2 desks ahead, his crimson eyes narrowed in suspicion. For weeks, the explosive blonde had been watching his favorite punching bag transform. Deku wasn't flinching when Bakugo slammed his hands on his desk. Deku wasn't crying. Deku's eyes, usually wide with terror, were now hooded, focused, and disturbingly calm. And Deku was getting wider. His uniform shirt, usually loose and baggy, was beginning to pull tight across his shoulders and chest. Bakugo hated it. He hated the way Deku looked at him now, not with fear, but with a quiet, analytical patience. It made Bakugo's skin crawl. It made his blood boil. He wanted to corner the nerd, blow him to kingdom come, and demand to know what the hell was going on. But every time Bakugo approached, Izuku simply looked past him, packed his bag, and walked out the door with a single, calm statement. I have training to do, Kaken. Excuse me? It infuriated Bakugo to no end. But the explosion was yet to come. Month 2 bled into month 3. The weather grew hotter as summer approached, turning Takoba Municipal Beach Park into a humid, stinking oven. But the progress was undeniable. A large section of the beach near the stairs was completely cleared of small and medium debris, revealing the beautiful, pale sand beneath for the first time in a decade. Izuku's body was transforming. The grueling labor, combined with the incredibly strict caloric surplus he had designed, was forcing his body to adapt rapidly. He was no longer a scrawny, fragile twig. Lean, dense muscle wrapped around his arms and torso. His core was a wall of solid tension. When he hauled a heavy object, his back rippled with newly forged strength. He was becoming a vessel. One Saturday morning during the 3rd month, Toshinori was sitting on a massive, rusted steel I-beam that protruded from a tangled mountain of wrecked cars. He was in his skeletal form, wearing a baggy white t-shirt and sunglasses, holding an umbrella to block the sweltering sun. Down on the sand, Izuku was tying a thick hemp rope around the front axle of a dilapidated sedan. Your form is improving, Midoriya. Toshinori called out, taking a sip from a water bottle. You're utilizing your lower body much better. But remember, when you receive one for all, the backlash won't just be in your muscles. It's a strain on your skeletal structure. You must learn to distribute the force evenly. Yes, sir! Izuku shouted back, wiping a river of sweat from his forehead. He grabbed the heavy rope, throwing it over his shoulder. He dug his feet into the sand, leaning forward at a sharp 45-degree angle. He squeezed his eyes shut, clamped his jaw, and pulled. The rope groaned, pulling taut like a guitar string. The sedan shuddered, its rusted wheel rims scraping against the sand. Slowly, agonizingly, Izuku dragged the 2-ton vehicle an inch, then a foot, then a yard. Toshinori watched, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. He's incredibly strong for a 14-year-old, Toshinori thought. His dedication is unmatched. But, the doubt was still there. A persistent, annoying itch in the back of his mind. He couldn't shake it. He kept waiting for a moment to test the boy's instincts, but nothing ever happened. It was just safe, controlled training. Toshinori knew that the true measure of a hero was only revealed in the crucible of absolute terror. Suddenly, a sharp, happy bark echoed across the beach. Izuku dropped the rope, gasping for breath, and turned around with a bright smile. Trotting over the sand was a small, scruffy dog. It looked like a mix between a terrier and a Shiba Inu, its fur matted with dirt and salt. It carried a filthy tennis ball in its mouth. "Hey, buddy," Izuku laughed, dropping to his knees. The dog bounded over, dropping the ball in Izuku's lap and furiously licking the sweat off his chin. "Ah, the local wildlife," Toshinori mused from his perch on the I-beam. "You've been feeding him, haven't you?" "I can't help it, All Might," Izuku said, scratching the dog behind the ears. "He's a stray. He hangs around the junk piles looking for food. I've been giving him some of the boiled chicken from my meal prep. I named him Trash. Lovingly, of course." "Trash," Toshinori repeated dryly. "A fitting name for a beachcomber. Just make sure he doesn't get in the way of the heavy machinery, my boy." I know. Izuku picked up the tennis ball and hurled it down the shoreline. Trash barked happily and sprinted after it, his little paws kicking up sand. Izuku stood up, stretching his aching back. He looked at the massive pile of junk behind the sedan he had just moved. It was a towering, precarious cliff of heavy debris. 4 stacked, rusted cars formed the base, topped with industrial washing machines, tangled rebar, and the massive steel I-beam that Toshinori was currently sitting on. Izuku frowned, his analytical mind kicking in. He stepped closer, examining the base of the pile. All Might?" Izuku called out. "By moving this sedan, I think I might have destabilized the lower foundation of that pile. The weight distribution looks really uneven now. The lowest car is sitting on a slope of loose sand, and the structural integrity." A loud, agonizing metallic screech ripped through the air. Izuku froze. Toshinori froze. Above them, the towering mountain of scrap metal shuddered. A thick cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The rusted car at the bottom of the pile buckled under the immense weight of the junk above it. "Whoa!" Toshinori yelped as the I-beam he was sitting on suddenly tilted violently. He scrambled backward, sliding down the back side of the junk pile to safety. "All Might!" Izuku yelled, taking a step back as the mountain of metal began to groan and sway, the laws of gravity finally collecting their toll. Thousands of pounds of steel, glass, and iron were shifting, beginning a slow, unstoppable avalanche toward the sand below. "I'm fine, Midoriya." "Stay back." Toshinori coughed from the other side of the pile, a cloud of dust rising into the air. "Let it fall. It's too heavy to stop." Izuku took several steps back, watching the terrifying cascade of metal begin to break apart. It was a small-scale disaster, and then Izuku heard it, a sharp, panic yelp. Izuku snapped his head toward the sound. Directly in the path of the falling avalanche, digging furiously into the sand after his half-buried tennis ball, was Trash. The little dog was completely oblivious to the shadow of death looming above him. Time seemed to grind to an absolute halt. The ambient noise of the beach, the crashing waves, the grinding metal, faded into a muffled, underwater silence. Izuku's brain, usually so prone to overthinking, to calculating, to analyzing, completely shut down. The equation in front of him was simple. Thousands of pounds of metal were falling. A life was underneath it. In that microsecond, Izuku didn't think about his lack of a quirk. He didn't think about his training. He didn't think about the very real, mathematical certainty that he was about to be crushed into a bloody paste. His body simply moved. "Trash!" Izuku screamed, his legs exploding into motion. On the other side of the pile, Toshinori heard the scream. He scrambled up a relatively stable pile of tires, looking over the crest just in time to witness the most terrifying, awe-inspiring moment of his life. Tashinori saw the dog. He saw the avalanche of steel descending. And he saw his successor, a quirkless 14-year-old boy, sprinting directly into the epicenter of destruction. Midoriya! No! Tashinori roared, his voice cracking with sheer terror. He desperately tried to summon One for All, trying to force his skeletal body to expand into his muscle form. But he was too far away, he was too slow. A sharp pain stabbed through his ruined stomach, and he coughed violently, blood splattering the tires. I can't make it! Izuku reached the dog just as the shadow of the falling metal eclipsed the sun. A massive, rusted industrial washing machine, followed by the tangled chassis of a truck, plummeted toward them. Izuku knew he couldn't push the dog out of the way in time. He couldn't catch the metal, it weighed a ton. Brute force was impossible. He needed physics. His eyes darted frantically, absorbing the chaotic environment in a millisecond. Leverage! To his left was the heavy, solid cast-iron engine block of the sedan he had moved earlier. It was anchored deep in the sand. Immovable. To his right, sticking out of the falling debris, was a long, thick steel construction pipe. Izuku dove. He snatched the small dog by the scruff of its neck, tossing it backward between his legs, out of the immediate kill zone. In the same fluid motion, his hand snapped out, grabbing the thick steel pipe as it fell. He didn't try to stop it. He guided it. Izuku jammed one end of the steel pipe violently down onto the solid iron engine block. The engine block became the fulcrum. The falling washing machine and truck chassis crashed onto the middle of the steel pipe. Izuku threw his entire body weight, every ounce of muscle he had built over the last 3 months, every drop of his agonizing labor, onto the opposite end of the pipe. Class 1 lever! Izuku's mind screamed. Multiply the force! The impact was catastrophic. The sound of metal slamming into metal was deafening. The sheer kinetic energy of the falling junk transferred through the pipe, instantly bending the thick steel into a violent, screaming curve. Izuku took the brunt of the kinetic shockwave. The pipe slammed upward against his hands and shoulders. He screamed as the flesh on his palms tore open, blood instantly soaking into his canvas gloves. The muscles in his back and legs seized, tearing microfibers as they were subjected to an impossible load. But the pipe didn't snap. The engine block didn't shatter, and Izuku didn't break. With his teeth bared, blood vessels popping in his eyes, Izuku held the lever. He became a human anchor, his boots digging trenches into the sand, his entire body trembling violently as he held up a multi-ton avalanche of steel just inches above his head. Run! Izuku roared, his voice tearing his throat. Beneath the makeshift, agonizingly fragile tent of bent steel and groaning junk, the terrified little dog scrambled backward, whining in fear, darting out from under the pile and sprinting down the beach. The second the dog was clear, Izuku's strength gave out. His muscles failed. The pipe slipped from his bloody grip. With a thunderous, earth-shaking crash, the mountain of metal collapsed fully, burying the spot where Izuku and the dog had been seconds before in a suffocating cloud of dust and rust. Midoriya! The scream tore from Tashinori's throat, raw and agonizing. It was the scream of a man watching his greatest hope, his chosen son, die. Golden lightning erupted around Tashinori. He didn't care about his limit. He didn't care about the pain in his chest. His body violently expanded, muscles bulging, steam exploding into the air as All Might materialized in a terrifying display of raw, desperate power. All Might leaped over the wreckage, his massive hands digging violently into the pile of steel. He ripped cars apart like they were made of paper. He hurled washing machines over his shoulder, his eyes wide with a frantic, suffocating panic. Please, Tashinori prayed, tearing through an eye beam. Please don't be dead. Please, All Might. Tashinori froze. He ripped away a final sheet of rusted corrugated tin. There, lying on his back in a shallow crater of sand, was Izuku. He had thrown himself backward the millisecond his grip failed, narrowly avoiding being crushed by the main bulk of the wreckage. He was a mess. His shirt was torn and soaked with sweat and dirt. His canvas gloves were stained deep red with blood. His arms were shaking uncontrollably, trembling with the severe shock of muscular overload. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving, but he was alive. All Might dropped to his knees, the impact shaking the sand. The towering hero reached out with massive, trembling hands, gently pulling the battered boy upright. Midoriya, All Might breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Are you alright? Izuku groaned, his head lolling slightly before he managed to focus his glassy eyes on his mentor. He looked past All Might, his gaze frantically sweeping the beach until he spotted the small, scruffy dog sitting safely by the shoreline, watching them. Izuku let out a long, ragged exhale, a weak, bloody smile spreading across his face. The fulcrum, Izuku whispered, his voice hoarse. I remembered the torque equation the engine block held. All Might stared at the boy, the doubt. The lingering, nagging whisper of Sir Night Eye. The fear that this analytical, cautious boy would freeze when faced with the terrifying reality of death. It completely, instantly vaporized. Tashinori had just witnessed the absolute pinnacle of heroism. He had seen a quirkless child look at an impossible, lethal situation, and without a single moment of hesitation, throw his life on the line to save the helpless. And he hadn't done it with mindless, suicidal brute force. He had done it with his intellect. He had used his mind to amplify his meager strength and perform a miracle. Night Eye, Tashinori thought, tears pricking the corners of his blue eyes. You were wrong. Togata is a fine candidate. But this boy is something else entirely. You reckless fool, All Might whispered, his booming voice incredibly gentle. He pulled Izuku into a massive, bear-hug embrace, burying the boy against his broad chest. You absolute, brilliant, reckless fool. You could have died. Izuku winced slightly as his strained muscles protested, but he leaned into the embrace, the adrenaline slowly leaving his system. I didn't think, Izuku mumbled into the hero's chest. My body just moved on its own. All Might pulled back, looking down at the boy. He placed his heavy hands on Izuku's shoulders. There are stories about every great hero, All Might said softly, quoting the very words he had spoken to Izuku in his mind months ago. How they became great. Most have one thing in common, their bodies moved before they had a chance to think. Izuku's eyes widened, shimmering with unshed tears. He recognized the significance of those words. Today, Midoriya, All Might said, his signature smile returning, radiant and filled with absolute, unwavering pride, you proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that you possess the true heart of a hero, the madness, the instinct. All Might looked at the twisted, destroyed pile of metal, and the bent steel pipe resting on the engine block. And All Might added, chuckling warmly, you proved that when you inherit my power, you won't just be a blunt instrument. You will be a tactical genius. You saved a life today, Izuku. Be proud. The dam broke. The pain, the exhaustion, and the overwhelming validation crashed over Izuku all at once. He buried his face in his bloody, gloved hands and sobbed, his shoulders shaking. But this time, they weren't tears of grief or release. They were tears of pure, unadulterated triumph. 2 hours later, after All Might had bandaged Izuku's torn hands and insisted he take the rest of the weekend off from heavy lifting, Izuku was walking home. His muscles ached with a deep, throbbing fire. Every step was a chore. His hands stung, the tight white bandages bulky under his long sleeves. He smelled like sweat, rust, and salt, but he had never felt better in his entire life. He walked past a row of storefronts in the shopping district. The glass windows reflected the afternoon sun. Izuku stopped, turning to look at his reflection in a dark, tinted window. He stared at the boy looking back at him. The boy in the reflection didn't look like a Deku. His jaw was set. His shoulders, though aching, were broad and straight. His eyes held a calm, fierce intensity. The muscles in his forearms, visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves, were defined and hard. He was no longer just dreaming of being a hero. He was forging himself into one. He had faced death, and he hadn't blinked. Izuku raised a bandaged hand, pressing it flat against the cold glass of the window, directly over the reflection of his own heart. 7 months left, Izuku thought, a confident, determined smile crossing his face. I'm going to clear that entire beach. I'm going to take one for all. And then, I'm going to UA. He turned and continued his walk home, his stride purposeful. But as he turned the corner, his confident stride faltered just a fraction. Standing at the end of the block, leaning against a brick wall with his arms crossed and an incredibly dark, volatile scowl on his face, was Katsuki Bakugo. Bakugo's crimson eyes locked onto Izuku. He took in the bruised, exhausted posture, the bandaged hands, and the unmistakable, infuriating aura of confidence radiating from the nerd. Bakugo pushed off the wall, small, dangerous sparks crackling in his palms. The time for watching was over. It was time for answers. Katsuki Bakugo knew, with the absolute, unquestionable certainty of a mathematical law, that he was better than everyone else. He didn't think this out of mere vanity. It wasn't a delusion of grandeur cooked up to compensate for some hidden inadequacy. It was simply an empirical fact, observed and validated every single day of his life since he was 4 years old. He sat at his desk in the third-year classroom of Aldera Junior High, leaning back so his chair balanced precariously on its 2 hind legs. He rested his feet casually on the wooden surface of the desk, his hands clasped behind his head. The late spring breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the scent of blooming cherry blossoms and the distant hum of Mizutafu's city traffic. But Katsuki wasn't paying attention to any of it. He was looking at his hands. Even at rest, his palms felt warm. The sweet, sharp scent of caramelized sugar and ozone constantly lingered on his skin. It was the scent of power. Nitroglycerin sweat. An evolutionary masterpiece. His quirk wasn't just flashy. It was incredibly lethal, endlessly versatile, and completely under his flawless control. Katsuki let a microscopic spark pop against his index finger. Snap. It was no louder than the click of a pen, but it sent a thrill of dominance down his spine. He glanced around the classroom. The teacher was droning on at the chalkboard about high school entrance exams, graphing out percentile requirements for various local academies. Katsuki felt a sneer curl his lip. Look at them, he thought, his crimson eyes scanning his classmates. To his left sat a guy whose quirk allowed him to pull his eyes out of their sockets on stalks. Useless. To his right, a girl who could make her hair change color based on her mood. Pathetic. In front of him, one of his friends, fingers extended into long, creepy wooden blocks. Cannon fodder. They were all extras. Background characters in the grand, sweeping epic that was the life of Katsuki Bakugo. They were born to be stepping stones, a sea of mediocrity meant to highlight his brilliance. He was going to UA High School. He was going to ace the impossibly hard entrance exam, shatter every record, and become the #1 hero. He would surpass All Might, not just in strength, but in sheer, undeniable victory. He would be the richest, the most famous, the most undisputed champion in the history of heroics. It was his destiny. The universe had ordained it the moment his quirk manifested. Nothing could challenge him. Nothing could stand in his way, except... Katsuki's crimson eyes shifted forward, locking onto the back of a head crowned with a mess of unruly, dark green curls. Deku. Just the thought of the nickname made the nitroglycerin in Katsuki's palms heat up, an involuntary physical reaction to the spike of pure, unadulterated irritation that flared in his chest. Izuku Midoriya sat 2 rows ahead, hunched slightly over his desk, scribbling furiously in a notebook. He didn't have a quirk. He didn't have power. By all the laws of nature and society, Midoriya was the absolute lowest rung on the evolutionary ladder. He was a pebble. A speck of dust. He was literally a Deku, the one who couldn't achieve anything. And yet... Katsuki let his chair drop forward with a sharp clack, his scowl deepening into a ferocious glower. Something was wrong with the nerd. It had started a few months ago. Katsuki remembered the exact day the shift began. It was the day after Katsuki had grabbed the nerd's stupid, pathetic hero analysis notebook, blown it up, and tossed it out the window. He had told Deku to take a swan dive off the roof. It was harsh, sure, but it was a necessary reality check. He was doing the idiot a favor. Better to crush his delusions now before a villain smeared him across the pavement. Katsuki had expected Deku to show up to school the next day a weeping, broken mess. He expected the nerd to finally give up, to finally look at Katsuki with the absolute despair and submission that an extra should show to a god. But Deku hadn't done that. Instead, Deku had walked into the classroom with his back straight. His eyes, usually wide, watery, and constantly darting around in terror, were locked forward. They were dark, calm, and terrifyingly focused. At first, Katsuki thought it was a fluke. A temporary burst of fake bravado. He had slammed his hands down on Deku's desk, unleashing a small explosion to put the nerd back in his place. Normally, Deku would have shrieked, covered his head, and mumbled a frantic string of apologies while shaking like a leaf. But on that day, Deku had just sat there. The smoke had cleared, and Deku had looked up at Katsuki, his green eyes unblinking, utterly devoid of fear. "Excuse me, Kaken," Deku had said, his voice quiet but steady. "I need to finish these notes before the bell." Katsuki's blood boiled just remembering it. The absolute audacity. The sheer, blinding disrespect. Since that day, the changes had only grown more pronounced, creeping in like a disease infecting Katsuki's perfect reality. He stared at Deku's back now, his eyes narrowing, analyzing the physical anomalies that were driving him insane. The elder junior high uniform, a standard black kakurin, was meant to be loose. For 10 years, it had hung off Deku's scrawny, frail frame like a hand-me-down on a skeleton. But now the fabric pulled taut across the nerd's shoulders. When Deku reached up to scratch the back of his neck, the sleeve rode up slightly, and Katsuki's sharp eyes caught the unmistakable, dense flex of a defined bicep. "Muscle?" Katsuki thought, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. When the hell did the pebble get muscle? It wasn't just the muscles either. It was the bandages. Every single day, Deku came to school with fresh medical tape wrapped around his fingers, his wrists, or peeking out from the collar of his shirt. Sometimes he reeked of cheap antiseptic cream, sometimes he smelled like salt water and rusted metal. He walked with a heavy, deliberate, exhausting gait, like a man carrying a boulder on his back, yet he never complained. He just slept. Half the time in class, Deku was dead to the world, his head resting on his desk, dead asleep. But the teachers rarely called him out, because his test scores had inexplicably skyrocketed. The nervous energy Deku used to waste on muttering and twitching was entirely gone, replaced by a ruthless, terrifying efficiency. Katsuki leaned to his right, catching a glimpse of Deku's hands as the nerd reached for an eraser. The hands were ruined. Katsuki could see thick, yellowed calluses tearing through the medical tape on Deku's palms. They were the hands of a manual laborer, someone who had been grinding their flesh against something utterly unforgiving for hours every single day. "What are you doing?" Katsuki's mind roared. "What the hell are you planning?" A piece of chalk snapped at the front of the room. "All right, that's enough for the lecture," the homeroom teacher sighed, wiping chalk dust from his hands. "Since the weather is nice, the physical education department wants to run the midterm baseline fitness tests today. Everyone head out to the track and field grounds." A collective groan went up from the class. Katsuki, however, felt a vicious smirk pull at the corners of his mouth. Physical fitness tests. Perfect. This was his domain. This was where the hierarchy of the world was displayed in cold, hard numbers. He would crush every record, remind these extras of their place, and more importantly, he would see exactly what the hell Deku had been doing for the last 3 months. The sun beat down on the Aldera Junior High athletic field. The dirt track was dry and dusty, the heat shimmering off the ground. Katsuki stood at the starting line of the 50-meter dash, rolling his shoulders. He didn't even bother stretching. He didn't need to. "Ready, go!" The gym teacher blew the whistle. Katsuki didn't just run. He exploded. He threw his hands backward, unleashing twin, perfectly timed blasts of nitroglycerin that propelled his body forward like a human missile. The sheer kinetic force tore up the dirt track behind him, leaving his opponent choking in a cloud of smoke. He crossed the finish line in a blur. 5.1 seconds, the teacher called out, clicking the stopwatch. "TCH. Slow," Katsuki muttered, shaking out his hands. It was the fastest time in the school's history, but he knew he could hit 4.9 if he angled his wrists better. He walked back toward the shaded bleachers, ignoring the awestruck murmurs of his classmates. He grabbed a water bottle, twisting the cap off violently. He took a long drink, his eyes scanning the crowd of students until he found his target. Midoriya was standing near the grip strength testing station, quietly waiting his turn. Katsuki walked over, deliberately positioning himself a few yards away, crossing his arms and glaring. He remembered last year's physical tests. Deku had been a pathetic, wheezing mess. He had run the 50-meter dash in 8.5 seconds, and his grip strength had barely cracked 20 kilograms. He was a joke. Next up, Midoriya, the gym teacher said, holding out the digital dynamometer. Deku stepped forward. He reached out with his right hand, the knuckles wrapped in stark white athletic tape. Katsuki watched like a hawk. He looked for the tremble. He looked for the weakness. Deku didn't hesitate. He grasped the device. He didn't scream, he didn't grunt. He just closed his eyes, took a slow, deep breath, and squeezed. Katsuki saw the muscles in Deku's forearm contract. The veins pushed against the skin, thick and pronounced. The sheer tension in Deku's stance was alarming. It looked as if his entire body had momentarily turned to stone. Beep. Deku handed the device back to the teacher. The teacher looked at the digital readout, his eyebrows shooting up to his hairline. He blinked, tapped the side of the machine as if he suspected it was broken, and looked at it again. 56 kilograms, the teacher announced, his voice tinged with disbelief. A ripple of murmurs went through the nearby students. 56 kilograms. For an average 14-year-old with no strength-enhancing quirk, that wasn't just good. That was exceptional. That was the grip strength of an adult athlete. Katsuki's water bottle crumpled in his hand, the plastic cracking under his sudden, furious grip. Water spilled over his knuckles, dripping into the dirt. 56. It was almost triple what Deku had scored last year. How? Katsuki's mind raged. You don't have a quirk. You can't just triple your strength in 3 months. That's biologically impossible. What kind of sick, twisted trick are you playing? The test continued, and with every passing minute, Katsuki's fury escalated. Standing long jump. Deku cleared the sandpit with a solid, explosive leap, utilizing a form so mechanically perfect it looked like he had studied the physics of the human body for years. Seated toe touch. Deku bent forward, displaying a terrifyingly rigid core, completely ignoring the visible strain on his face as he pushed himself past his physical limits. Endurance run. Deku didn't just run. He paced himself with robotic precision, his breathing rhythmic and controlled, completely outpacing the rest of the quirkless or weak quirk students, crossing the finish line drenched in sweat but utterly composed. Katsuki watched it all from the sidelines, his breathing growing shallow, small pops of explosions involuntarily sparking across his palms. He was angry, yes. But beneath the anger, buried beneath layers of impenetrable ego, was a horrific, squirming sensation that Katsuki Bakugo absolutely despised. It felt like fear. No, not fear. Insult. Katsuki stalked away from the track, heading toward the locker rooms, his mind racing. He thought back to the river. When they were kids. 4 years old. Katsuki had been walking across a log bridge, full of confidence, leading his pack of extras. He had slipped and fallen into the shallow water below. It was nothing. A scrape. He was fine. He was tough. But Deku had scrambled down the embankment. Deku, who didn't have a quirk. Deku, who tripped over his own feet. Deku had held out a hand to Katsuki, looking down at him with those massive, trembling green eyes. Are you okay? Can you stand? That was the moment Katsuki's hatred was born, because in that moment, Deku had looked at him not as a god, not as a superior being, but as an equal. Worse, he had looked at him as someone who needed saving. How dare he? How dare this empty, hollow, useless pebble look down on the chosen one? For the next 10 years, Katsuki had made it his mission to put Deku in his place. To remind him that he was nothing, and for 10 years it had worked. Deku had cowered. Deku had cried. But now, looking at the calloused hands, the defined muscles, and the unwavering stare, Katsuki realized his reality was fracturing. Deku wasn't giving up. Deku was preparing. He's plotting something, Katsuki convinced himself, slamming his locker shut with a concussive force that dented the metal door. He thinks he can trick me. He thinks he can train his pathetic, quirkless body and somehow challenge me. He's looking down on me again. He thinks I'm stupid. Katsuki stared at his reflection in the dented metal of the locker. His red eyes were burning. "I'll kill him," Katsuki whispered to the empty locker room, smoke curling from his nostrils. "I'll rip whatever secret he's hiding right out of his mouth." The final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day. The classroom immediately erupted into chaos as students grabbed their bags, chattering about weekend plans, arcades, and karaoke. Katsuki remained at his desk, his bag slung over one shoulder, his eyes fixed firmly on the front of the room. Usually, Deku was a slow packer. He would linger, organizing his pencils, checking his notebooks, trying to avoid leaving at the same time as Katsuki. But not today. The second the bell tolled, Deku stood up. He grabbed his faded yellow backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and walked straight toward the door. He didn't look left. He didn't look right. He just moved with an agonizingly determined purpose. "Hey, Bakugo!" One of Katsuki's lackeys, the guy with the wooden fingers, walked up, grinning. "We're hitting the arcade near the station. Want to come? I heard they got that new fighting game." "Screw off," Katsuki snarled, not even looking at him. The lackey recoiled, holding up his hands. "Whoa, okay, man. Chill out." Katsuki shoved past him, his shoulder slamming hard into the lackey's chest, knocking the boy off balance. He stepped out into a hallway, his eyes locking onto the tuft of green hair disappearing around the corner near the stairwell. Katsuki followed. He kept his distance, stalking Deku through the halls of Aldura, out the front gates, and onto the bustling sidewalks of Muzurifu. The afternoon sun was sinking lower, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pavement. The streets were crowded with commuters, shoppers, and the occasional pro-hero patrolling the district. Katsuki walked with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his posture aggressive, his face set in a permanent scowl. He watched Deku navigate the crowd. The nerd moved differently now. He didn't shy away from people. He slipped through the gaps in the crowd with a strange, fluid grace, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. It was the walk of someone who was acutely aware of their environment. "Where are you going?" Katsuki thought, his frustration mounting with every step. "This isn't the way to your house." They walked for 20 minutes, leaving the commercial district and entering the older, more industrial edge of the city. The buildings here were weathered, the streets narrower and quieter. Finally, Deku turned down a narrow, shadowed alleyway that cut between a closed-down grocery store and an abandoned warehouse. It was a shortcut that led toward the coastal highway. Katsuki stopped at the entrance to the alley. The air was thick with tension. It was perfectly isolated. No teachers. No pro-heroes. Just the two of them. Katsuki stepped into the shadows of the alley. "Hey!" Katsuki barked, his voice echoing sharply off the brick walls. Deku stopped halfway down the alley. He didn't jump. He didn't squeak. He just slowly turned around, his hands resting lightly on the straps of his yellow backpack. The setting sun caught Deku's eyes, turning them into chips of hard emerald glass. "Kaken," Deku said softly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He had known Katsuki was following him. That realization sent a violent jolt of rage straight into Katsuki's brain. He knew. "He's been letting me follow him?" Katsuki stalked forward, the distance between them evaporating in seconds. Small, aggressive explosions began to pop in his palms, lighting up the dim alleyway with sharp flashes of orange and yellow light. The smell of burning ozone and caramel filled the air. "Don't give me that calm crap, Deku," Katsuki snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stopped just 2 feet away from Izuku, towering slightly over him. "I've been watching you for 3 months. You're acting like a freak. You're hiding something." Izuku looked at the explosions popping in Katsuki's hands. In the past, the mere sight of those sparks would have sent Izuku into a hyperventilating panic. He would have covered his face, backed away, pleaded for mercy. Instead, Izuku simply looked back up, meeting Katsuki's furious red gaze directly. "I'm not hiding anything, Kaken," Izuku said, his voice completely level. "I'm just busy." "Busy?" Katsuki exploded, grabbing the collar of Izuku's uniform with his left hand, violently shoving the nerd backward until his shoulders slammed hard against the brick wall of the alley. The impact knocked the breath from Izuku's lungs, but he didn't cry out. Katsuki brought his right hand up, planting it heavily against the brick right next to Izuku's face. He let off a larger explosion, boom, scorching the brick and sending a wave of blistering heat washing over Izuku's cheek. "Don't screw with me, you quirkless piece of garbage!" Katsuki roared, spittle flying from his lips. "I saw your tests today. 56 kilos? You've got bandages all over your damn arms. You're suddenly acting like you're not a pathetic little bug. What the hell is your game? Are you trying to make me look like an idiot?" The smoke from the explosion cleared. Izuku's cheek was slightly red from the heat, and a few strands of his green hair were singed. But his expression hadn't changed. He didn't flinch. He didn't break eye contact. "I'm not playing a game," Izuku said, his voice cutting through Katsuki's rage like a cold, sharp knife. "Then explain it," Katsuki demanded, his grip on Izuku's collar tightening, his knuckles turning white. "You're a deku. You're nothing. You don't get to look at me like that. You don't get to act like you're on my level. You are a pebble in my path." Izuku looked at Katsuki. Really looked at him. For 10 years, Izuku had seen Katsuki as an insurmountable wall. A terrifying, brilliant, unstoppable force of nature. But right now, pinned against a brick wall with an explosion inches from his face, Izuku didn't see a monster. He saw someone who was fundamentally terrified of losing his place in the world. Izuku remembered the weight of the steel pipe in his hands a few weeks ago. He remembered the deafening crash of the metal, and the profound, absolute certainty that he was willing to die to save a stray dog. He remembered the heavy, warm hand of All Might on his shoulder, telling him he was worthy. The fear was completely gone. Izuku reached up. He grabbed Katsuki's left wrist, the hand gripping his collar. Katsuki felt a shock go through his arm. Deku's grip was like an iron vice. The fingers digging into Katsuki's wrist were hard, rough, and uncompromising. "Let go," Izuku said quietly. Katsuki froze. His brain short-circuited. He's fighting back?" "I said let go, Kaken." Izuku didn't yell. He didn't scream. But he applied pressure. The sheer physical force of Izuku's grip ground Katsuki's radius and ulna bones together, sending a sharp, agonizing spike of pain up his forearm. Involuntarily, Katsuki's fingers spasmed. He let go of Izuku's collar, taking a stumbling half-step backward in sheer shock. He stared at his wrist, the pale skin already turning red in the shape of Deku's fingers, and then looked back up at the boy he had tormented his entire life. Izuku stepped away from the wall. He adjusted his backpack straps, standing tall. He looked directly into Katsuki's wide, furious eyes. "You want to know what I'm doing, Kaken?" Izuku asked, the air around him seeming to hum with a quiet, terrifying gravity. "I'll tell you." Katsuki couldn't speak. His throat felt tight. The explosions in his palms had died out completely. "I told you on the last day of our first term," Izuku said, his voice echoing in the quiet alley. "I told you I was going to apply to UA High School. The hero course. You can't," Katsuki stammered, the rage battling with an intense, suffocating disbelief. "They don't accept quirkless nobodies. You'd die in the entrance exam. I told you to take a swan dive." "I don't care what you told me," Izuku interrupted, his tone steel. "I don't care what the school says. I don't care about the statistics. Someone told me I could do it. Someone showed me that if I work harder than anyone else, if I break my body down and build it back up, I can be a hero." Izuku took a step forward. For the first time in his life, Katsuki Bakugo took a step back. "I'm not looking down on you, Kaken," Izuku said softly, though the words hit like a physical blow. "I never have. I've always admired your strength. Your quirk is amazing. You have everything it takes to be a great pro-hero. But you don't own the sky. You don't own the title." Izuku clenched his calloused, bandaged fists at his sides. The emerald light in his eyes flared with an intensity that burned hotter than any explosion Katsuki had ever created. "I am training for UA," Izuku declared, every syllable ringing with an absolute, world-shaking conviction. "I am going to pass the exam. I am going to enter the hero course, and I am going to stand in the exact same ring as you, Kaken. I am not going to be behind you anymore. I'm going to be right beside you. And then, I'm going to surpass you." The alley was dead silent. The distant sound of traffic seemed to exist in a completely different universe. Katsuki stood paralyzed. His brain desperately tried to process the information, tried to summon the rage, tried to summon the superiority that defined his very existence. He wanted to scream. He wanted to blow the nerd to kingdom come. He wanted to laugh in his face and call him a delusional freak, but he couldn't. Because looking at Izuku Midoriya in this moment, looking at the calluses, the rigid posture, and the eyes of a boy who had looked death in the face and smiled, Katsuki knew, with terrifying, absolute certainty, that Deku wasn't lying. Deku wasn't delusional. He meant every single word. Izuku held Katsuki's gaze for 3 more agonizing seconds, ensuring the message was delivered. Then, without another word, Izuku turned his back on Katsuki. He didn't run. He walked. Calmly, deliberately, toward the end of the alleyway, heading back out onto the street to continue his journey to the beach. Katsuki Bakugo stood alone in the shadows. He looked down at his trembling hands. The palms that could create fire. The hands that were supposed to shape the world to his whim. They felt heavy. Useless. He turned his back on me, Katsuki thought, a cold, sickening dread pooling in his stomach. He turned his back on me and walked away, and I couldn't even move. Katsuki let out a shuddering breath, his teeth grinding together so hard he tasted copper in his mouth. The ego that had shielded him his entire life had just suffered its first massive, unrepairable crack. The pebble wasn't a pebble at all, it was a mountain. And it was rising. Deku, Katsuki whispered into the empty alley, his voice shaking with a terrifying cocktail of absolute hatred and a brand new, deeply buried fear. I'll kill you. I swear to God. I'll kill you. The sparks ignited in his palms again, but they felt different this time. They weren't sparks of effortless dominance. They were the frantic, desperate sparks of a god who had just realized he was bleeding,